All right, thank you. So I've called my talk Peer Assessment in Maths, Does It Work? And that is sort of a response to the attitude of your average mathematician. What I'm hoping to do in this talk is tell you a bit about how I have managed to convince my colleagues, even the ones who are not particularly education focused, that we can use peer assessment to our benefit and to students' benefit without too much hassle to the existing courses that we already have. So I'll talk about why peer assessment is important, and then what we're doing in Durham that I think is a bit different to other places. And then I've got a little bit of evaluation of how it's gone this year. So peer assessment is really important because it helps students to build up their skills. We know that the transition from school to university is really difficult for students, particularly because they get so much less support than they did when they were doing their A-levels. Some people would argue that this transition extends all the way into their second year, and at Durham at least, they get less and less time with us as they move from first to second through to their final year. And so building up some skills like feedback literacy can help to prepare them for this shift towards independence. Particularly using peer assessment is a great way to help them to build this feedback literacy. I'm also personally really interested in peer assessment as a tool to help students to get better at mathematical writing. I'm interested in the ways in which they present their mathematical work when they arrive, how they think they should be doing this coming off their A-levels, and how that changes through their time at university. And I think peer assessment is a great way to sort of bolster this transition for them. But the problem, really, this is all really lovely, and we can talk about all the great pedagogical reasons why we should use peer assessment. But in practice, convincing your common or garden maths lecturer that they should tear up an assignment that they're already perfectly happy with and start doing something differently in pursuit of some soft skills that not everyone is necessarily convinced we should be focusing on is really tricky. And a lot of the approaches to peer assessment that I see in the literature lean quite heavily on having students write reflections or, write down what they think they've learned this week and then peer assess that. And I don't know how it works in your departments, but I was never going to sell that to 80% of my department. So I've come up with a way of introducing peer assessment that I think is saleable and also pedagogically really valuable. So everything we were just saying about skills is great, but you can also point out that if students have good feedback literacy, they're more likely to really engage with the solutions we give them, less likely to email us slightly pointless questions, and more likely to value the solutions that we give them and the feedback that we give them, which we see coming out in places like the NSS. I would also point out to your colleagues, if you're trying to sell them on this, that if they get better at writing, it will be easier to do the marking. Students learning that they need to set their work out clearly is only going to be beneficial both to you and to the other lecturers in higher years who have to deal with these students later on. And if all else fails, you can point out that there will just be less marking to do if you give a peer assessment. The other side of this answer, apart from the sales pitch, is finding a format for peer assessment that has as little disruption as possible to the course that you're coming into, so that you can go to any lecturer or of any course and say, how about we introduce peer assessment? Here's a way that will fit in with what you're already doing. This is working reasonably well in maths at Durham at the minute. We ran it in 4 courses this year, so calculus and analysis in the first year, analysis in many variables in the second year. All three of those are core modules that all our maths students take. And then decision theory in the third year, which is one of the bigger third year modules. In each of these courses, we used peer assessment we replaced one assignment with a peer assessment per term. So they did 2 per year. And the plan is to get this into more courses this year. I will note that at least one colleague with a course that I've got my eye on is in this Zoom call. Hello, mate. And this is how we did it. We took an existing assignment. So we start off with an assignment that is already working. You do need to cut it down. If you're going to ask students to do the assignment and then mark the assignment, you are doubling or tripling the amount of work they spend per question. And so you do need to use fewer questions. But we take a piece of an existing assignment and we create roughly 3 versions of that question that are more or less equivalent. So here's an example from calculus. This is the first question on our first calculus peer assessment. And you can see all 3 versions are an initial value problem for a second order linear constant coefficient differential equation. We've just got different coefficients in there. So they're equivalent-ish versions of the question. Every student is assigned to one version of the sheet and writes up their answers to that version of the sheet. But then in the marking, they see different versions. So they're not marking the version that they worked on, they're marking something else. And we set up the final grade based on a combination of points for participation, points for getting the maths right as far as their peers are concerned, points for getting the maths right as far as their tutors are concerned, just in one case, and points for giving good feedback. I will say that they see all versions of the question with reasonably high probability. If you only ask them to mark 1 or 2 peers' work, there is a chance that they get the same version of the sheet in both cases. But it doesn't happen too often, actually, with the software we use. So that's the setup. We have used 2 different platforms at Durham this year, Feedback Fruits and Peer Scholar. The university is currently deciding which one we're going to go forward with next year, and I genuinely don't know which one. I hope it is. If you want to talk about how this works, I have lots of thoughts on both of them. But as a headline, the big pro of Peer Scholar is that you have infinite customization. This is the grading summary from the first calculus assignment this year. And you can see that we've got some marks available for just participating, uploading your answers, doing some marking. Some marks coming from what your peers, how many points your peers give you on each question. And that varies depending on the question. And here, and only in this assignment, some marks from a staff member marking it and giving their opinion on how the maths was. So this was great. We could, the lecturer could tinker with this to their heart's content and come up with whatever combination of points they wanted. On the other hand, Peer Scholar offers almost infinite customization, and it is very difficult to find anything. We had problems with finding the settings that we wanted. Sometimes the buttons are hard to find. Sometimes the data is hard to get out of it. Feedback Fruits, on the other hand, lets you set up an assignment very straightforwardly and very quickly. But then once you've done that, it's difficult to get any level of customization within it. You can see the grading summary here is much more basic and there's not as much weighting. So feel free to ask me about those later on. So having done this in 4 different courses, working with 5 different courses, working with 9 different lecturers this year, the things that I think are really important are choosing the right question. You want a question where you can create different versions that give you enough variety, but not too much variety. The difficulty level should be comparable, but you want to be able to cover a lot of ground with your question. Coming back to this example, there's actually something sneaky in here, which is that each of these initial value problems is qualitatively different to the others. Oh, I've misread that one. Never mind. The top one has 2 distinct real roots. The middle one I thought had 1 repeated real root because I didn't realize that 2 was there. And the bottom one has no real roots, which meant in theory that each of the 3 different types of differential equation were represented. And normally you would want to include 1 of each kind on a problem sheet. But here you can include 1 on each problem sheet and they'll see the different types as they mark. You want there to be some variety in how students will answer the question as well. Something that is too straightforward will result in almost identical solutions from all your students, and then there's not as much for them to get their teeth into and mark. On the other hand, you don't want a version of the sheet that's, a set of questions that have 500 different valid solutions, because that makes it really difficult for the students to mark. On which note, you need a really good mark scheme. You want your mark scheme to be absolutely airtight because students are brand new to this. A really nice example is here from our analysis peer assessment. This is great. It's missing how many marks you get for doing each part of it correctly. But we've got 2 different routes to the solution that use different results from the course. We've got good reference to the numbers in the lecture notes, and it's nice and clear. On the other hand, and I'm not going to name and shame here, I did get this after asking for the best possible rubric from someone. You get 5 marks if you got C right. This is not enough for students to be able to see what they need to do. The other really important thing, and that comes out in the surveys, is timing. You can't shove a peer assessment into a rigid existing schedule because students need time to do the maths, they need time to mark the maths, and they need time to log in and see what comments they got and say whether they were useful. Trying to fit all of these deadlines into 1 week is really tight, and trying to have some of these deadlines spill over into the next week's assignment is also going to impact that assignment. So think really carefully about the timing. So some evaluation of how it went. Firstly, on an informal level, the staff I talked to were generally keen to be involved and keen to do this again next year. Although it is true that I only asked staff who I thought would be keen to be involved. So maybe there's some selection bias there. Looking at the number of students who took part, the engagement was pretty similar to the other assignments that they had on sort of weeks either side. Whether those were written assignments or e-assessments, we didn't see a big fall off in engagement on the peer assessment. However, when we announced one of them, there was an audible loud groan, I'm told, in the lecture theatre. So they'll do it, but they're maybe a little bit reluctant. We also had some student surveys, as I said, so I sent out identical surveys to each of the cohorts, and I got about 10 responses from each cohort, which is not a lot, but just about enough to get some results. We know from the literature that in general, it's the act of giving feedback that is super beneficial to students. That's where they start to engage higher order thinking and really get into engaging with the solutions that were given. And the students themselves felt this. About 2/3 of them either said that giving feedback was useful or both were useful. We do have a solid core of about 5 or 6 students who really did not like peer assessment, and they answered neither no or strongly disagree to every question. You can see them there. Looking at whether they thought it was helpful, we see that it's not just that students thought receiving feedback was universally rubbish and they were lukewarm about giving feedback. There was sort of a mix of everything on the receiving front, but they really did, aside from those 5 stalwart haters, they really did overall agree that giving feedback was a helpful exercise to them. I also did a little bit of thematic analysis on the free text comments that they gave. So about a quarter of the higher year students, the 2nd and 3rd years, mentioned engaging more closely with the mark scheme. This was unprompted. The text box prompt was something like, do you have any other thoughts on peer assessment? And so they were quite likely to say, yeah, it really helped me get into the mark scheme. Or they said, it really helped me to see different approaches to the question and to understand a bit more about the maths. On the other hand, a lot of them used the word expert in conjunction with instructor. They said, I want my lecturer to mark it because they're an expert. And they really value this idea of someone who knows everything about the course marking it, which is not necessarily the case. But they have this strong feeling that their lecturers are the experts and nobody but the experts can give them useful feedback, and their peers don't understand the mark schemes at all. I think this is something we really need to work on with them, both giving them some more training so that they feel like their peers do understand the mark schemes, possibly improving the mark schemes that we give them. But also, I think this is part of a broader thing of them expecting us to be omnipotent and to be able to decipher everything they write because we're the experts, we have all the knowledge in the world. And I'd really like to see them start to shift towards viewing us as also humans who can teach them things. I thought this was a particularly nice quotation that I got in the free text box. This student said, most things that they were given as feedback were potential issues that I already knew I should work on, like my handwriting, like spacing out my work so that the other person can read it, clearly signposting what I was doing. I really wish I knew who this was because I would love to know why they're not doing this if they know that they should. I think that's a really interesting question. But also an interesting thing for them to be complaining about, because if you know you're handing in work where the handwriting's not great or the spacing isn't very good, why are you surprised that that's the comment that you're getting? A couple of students expressed my hope, which is that with a bit of experience, with a bit more time, some more practice, they'll start to find peer assessment more and more useful through the years. And I'm going to wrap up, as it's 29 minutes past, with a quotation from one of my stalwart peer assessment haters and a plea. If anyone can help me to decipher this quotation, I would really appreciate it. This student says, peer assessment is a myth. It doesn't work in undergraduate. I get useless flowery responses and give even more useless flowery responses just to increase the word count. It's like Bob the Builder giving a daffodil his task. I am not constructing anything useful. I do not understand this at all. If anyone knows what's going on, please do tell me. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thanks, Claire. And I'm certainly not going to offer any personal insight into that one, but maybe Kevin or Rachel will. You've done a really kind of great job of explaining there. The questions are sort of just starting to come in now, but perhaps if I may ask one first, which is you've kind of clearly highlighted you've got your eyes on other modules. How do you see this scaffolding through a degree? So obviously a lot of where you focus is kind of year one, but often sometimes the benefits are not seen until you've had sort of several experiences of this. How do you see this fitting across the program at Durham?
My hope is to get to a place where we can give the students opportunities for sort of self-led peer feedback in the final 2 years. So not necessarily assignments that fit. We mark 4 half assignments per term in 3rd year and 4th year. So they do sort of fortnightly assignments, which are meant to be fairly short, and we give them feedback on those. I'd love to be able to sort of facilitate them peer marking work between themselves in between that, so that they can keep getting feedback even on the ones that we're not marking ourselves. But I think to get there, to get them to that level of maturity, you need plenty of it in the first 2 years.
Yeah, and I think that investment is absolutely key. I mean, is that in any way related to having the sort of, there's a question about what are the reasons for having the sort of the 3 versions? I think that means that the 3 comparable sort of worksheets. What's the sort of thinking there?
Part of that is that it's easier to sell putting down the length of your problem sheet to 1/3 of its original length if you can maintain that variety and diversity of questions through having comparable versions. This worked so well in calculus because they would have had loads of differential equation questions to hand in so that they could see all the different types. Whereas by doing one of each type on each sheet, we know the students see all of it. And you have to do a shorter version of the sheet. You can't ask them to spend hours writing up the assignment and then just as long marking 2, 3, 4. From a student workload, student well-being perspective, you need something shorter. So by making different versions of it, we still manage to get all that content in there somewhere.
No, it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting approach, and so it's kind of selling this as a way of getting engagement, which I think is quite a nice strategy, because often we don't only think about that until the end, but that's very deliberate in your thinking, which is a good approach. I mean, taking a couple of questions slightly out of order, there's one that's coming from Bristol where they have sort of trialed two stage exams. So for colleagues unfamiliar with those, the broad way that they work is the sort of student will do something individually, and then they will come back and do a kind of a more group-based task of the same paper, with the idea they get the feedback in almost immediately afterwards. There's a question about, could that, so the 2-stage approach, be a stepping stone towards more constructive peer feedback? And just wondered about your thoughts on that, Claire.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of doing it, isn't it? Because you're also doing a lot of community building there by getting them to talk to each other. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'd like to try that.
And I think that's a theme that's really come through in your work, isn't it? That there's a question about sort of people can be irrational in their behavior, but a lot of what you've spoken about is the kind of the student communities piece, which is the sort of banner that we've put this under. And Adrian's asked the sort of question of, how do you ensure that level of fairness? So do you have to kind of do that sort of socialization with the students about how they manage this? Do you have any kind of pre-tasks of marking or moderating? Because all of this hangs upon the behaviors of those individuals. So how do you frame some of that?
Part of it is acknowledging that it's not necessarily going to be fair, but that the benefit to the students is in this part where they engage with it. Like you were saying at the end of the previous talk, as we talked about ChatGPT, in some senses, it's a learning opportunity for them, and the opportunity comes from doing it. It doesn't matter so much what you get back. But I think also the trick is to catch them early, right? Because when they come in the first term of their first year, they're fresh out of school, they think we're teachers, they call me miss. And if you say to them, what we do at university is peer assessment, they will believe you and they'll buy into it. But you do need some training. You do need to sort of pitch it in the right way.
Yeah, and I mean that's a sort of theme that's kind of come through sort of quite strongly in what you're saying, is that students tend to believe the mark of the member of staff, but not the marks of the students. And just picking up one final question about, obviously, students will give some marks, some feedback as part of your process. Is there staff checking there? Do you ever kind of have to override those in terms of that process? Because that must be a very delicate balance if you do, because it almost can undermine it if you're not careful. So welcome your thoughts on that.
We haven't done any moderation, and we really should ask the students whether they've got constructive comments. I think part of the mark coming from your peers rating whether you gave them good feedback does give them a bit of an incentive to do it well and to take it seriously. In calculus, because the assignment we were replacing was one that would be marked anyway, we had the resource to mark it by staff, and so we put staff marks into that formula as part of the final grade. The tutors hated this. They did not enjoy the staff marking interface on Peer Scholar, but I think it is an interesting exercise to just use that as a bit of a sanity check and compare the grades that they're getting from their peers with the grades that they're getting from the experts.
Yeah, and that's sort of really interesting, because often when I've seen it done that way, you tend to find that the students are far harsher on the marking than perhaps some of the staff members are. And that leads to quite an interesting discussion.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of our markers in calculus are actually final year students themselves, so they're already a little bit harsh.
Yeah, and that again is quite a nice theme that goes through and sort of lends itself well to your idea of building this through years. We've gone past the start time, probably because of, well, certainly because of me more than anything. But Claire, that was fantastic, and thanks for spending so much time answering questions. Costas, Alana, I think a big thank you to you both as well. And I think if we can have a round of applause for Claire, and indeed for Costas and Alana as well, in this final TOMA, which has been a really fantastic one.